Hello and welcome to beautiful Bellevue, Washington in the Statsig headquarters. My name is John Wilkie and I'm joined by two engineering and data science experts today, Craig Sexauer and Pierre Estephan. If you guys don't mind, tell us a little bit about what you do here at Statsig and maybe some of your prior experience. Craig, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm Craig. I'm a data scientist here at Statsig. I've been here for about a year, and I've had the chance to work on a lot of our experimentation algorithms and things like data warehouse imports. Before this, I was at Noom, and then before that, I was at Facebook.
And I'm Pierre. I'm an engineering manager on the console team here, which is the full stack product team here at Statsig. I've also been with Statsig for about a year. And prior to that, I was at Facebook working on search and gaming video for about 6 years.
Perfect. We've got so much knowledge in one very small room. So the topic of today's virtual meetup, this is the first Statsig virtual meetup of 2023. Looking at LinkedIn, at Fast Company, reading different posts, there's a lot of predictions. Ronnie Kohavi, who's kind of one of the experimentation thought leaders, is talking about simple experiments to run in 2023. Folks are going into planning sessions, looking at double and triple goals in terms of product launch and growth. Like, how do you separate the signal from the noise as you're going into planning for 2023 and thinking about an experimentation strategy?
Yeah, so in my experience, most of the time when we start a half, the most critical thing to get right is figuring out which projects you really want to invest your time in and which projects are really going to move the needle in terms of driving goals and company metrics. So typically we start with a big brainstorm with everyone involved, and you end up with 20 or 30 great ideas. And narrowing those down to the 3 or 4 that are really going to matter is not always the easiest thing to do. One of my favorite ways to do this is to scope down really tight MVPs of things that you want to test so that you can use data to drive that decision making. One example in my career is we were working on a gaming video recommendation system that we were thinking about putting in the comment section of videos to help you find similar streamers to the one that you're watching. It would have taken 4 to 6 months to really knock this project out of the park. You need input from an ML engineer to design the model that's gonna deliver the recommendations. You need to build it out on Android, on iOS, and web. You need to make it work in every country and every language. But there were trade-offs. If we put this thing in the comment section, it may pull away from the commenting experience. It might make you less engaged with the current video that you're watching. So to determine whether this was something that users were actually going to get value out of, we scoped it down to a 2 to 3 week project instead of the 4 to 6 months. We picked one platform to develop on. We decided to go with Android. We used a recommendation system that was being used in another part of the product, so we cut that scope. And we were able to quickly iterate to a small scope down version, which just let us test it with users and get some signal. And we found that it actually did detract far too much from the commenting experience, and we were able to cut that project. Using that data saved us probably 4 to 6 months of engineering time across several engineers. So using small scoped MVPs to whittle down your broad set of ideas to the 2 or 3 that are really going to be successful is something that's super important.
Yeah, I mean, something we've learned through practice and through working with customers is a lot of experiments, or a lot of product ideas rather, like, don't pan out. There's things you don't expect. People don't always respond the way you expect them to. I mean, especially if you're building these products for millions of users, you're going to have a lot of different perspectives and reactions to what you're building that, yeah, they can take you by surprise. Generally, like, we've seen that actually only a fraction of experiments will be successes, a lot are neutral, and some are actively negative. So figuring that out quickly saves a ton of resources and time, right? You can invest a month of effort and kind of languish under this, illusion that something's going to work. But you can also really early get signal with the test on, is this worth pursuing? Is this unexpectedly negative? And even if you decide to go with it, that gives you some direction to start from, right? You're not starting blind.
Yeah, so even a failed, scrappy, small experiment is still a success if you're able to learn and save resources, time, effort across the team, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Getting data and cutting and reducing wasted time is a win in and of itself.
The way I see it, right, like, one of the kind of classic parts of the analytics function is you can kind of use numbers that are out there in your product data to understand what ideas might work or not, right? You can say some things just won't work because there aren't enough people in the target audience. experiments are sort of the next step. They're like the crucible for ideas. So once you've narrowed down to the set of good ideas, you can sort of have them prove their mettle.
Great use of the word crucible. I also want to call Pierre used the acronym ML, which is machine learning, right? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so importance of failing fast, learning fast, saving those resources early, small, scrappy tests. When folks are thinking about what these tests look like, they're probably going to ask, okay, well, what metrics do I want to tie to? Whether it's a product metric, an overall business metric that maybe business leaders are setting for the year. Maybe walk us through, first of all, what is a metric if you're new to experimentation? And then, how do we pick the right ones to make sure that we're moving the needle and we can either prove whether or not these tests are successful or not?
Yeah, so a metric is just something that you use to measure whether the products and features that you're shipping are successful or not successful with the goal that you have in mind. There's two main things that I try to keep in mind when I'm picking a metric for a team. First, it needs to ladder up to company goals. So, if I'm shipping a new product and I'm measuring button clicks and I'm trying to move company revenue, button clicks may go up and that may not directly ladder to top line revenue. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, your goal cannot be so far removed from the product that it's not sensitive enough to measure the changes that you're actually making. So the example that I'll use for this is, if you're going to the gym regularly and you're trying to become stronger, using tons to measure the weight that you're lifting is not really going to measure your progress week to week. Using pounds is something that's much more applicable. Similarly, using something like top line revenue for shipping a new button into your product is not really going to be able to tell you whether adding that button was successful or not.
Yeah, I mean, this is as a data scientist, this topic is dear to my heart. And something I'll add on to that in terms of that gym metaphor is thinking about this in terms of like a strategic framework, something like, missions and objectives and strategies. And the metric that someone, a PM or an engineer is thinking about should map to that part of their organization, right? Holdouts, like company-wide tests, big bets should map onto top line revenue, because if it's not moving that, there's probably something wrong. But a team that is focused on like a specific page probably won't in the short term, a single test won't move top line revenue. So they should figure out how they're laddering up to revenue, mm-hmm. and why their team exists for a reason. They should be changing something. What is that thing? And then you figure out the best way to measure that thing.
Yeah. We can talk a little bit about specific metrics that have worked for us in the past.
Yeah, what's a good metric or a bad metric in your opinion? Feel free to hold some strong opinions and be honest here for everyone.
So for product teams, I think typically retention is the golden metric that would, confirm that you have product market fit, but it is very often a bad tracking metric because it is very, very slow to respond. Shipping a product and having a user have a good experience and then want to come back is a really long loop. So it might take, 3 to 4 months for you to measure an increase in retention given a feature that you've shipped. Something that is more sensitive than that, but is a good proxy for retention, is measuring something like daily active users. It's much higher in volume. You get more of that data. It's much more sensitive to changes, with a guardrail for your churn to make sure that you're not just bringing in users and having them walk out the door. So that's useful for product teams. For infra teams, I normally like to have something super granular and close to the product. So, if you're trying to improve performance, having CPU as a top line metric, or page load time specifically, or that tends to work best in my experience.
Yeah, and I think, something Pierre kind of alluded to there is you don't have to just pick one. Mm-hmm. Generally, the framework we've recommended to folks is you should have one metric that at least directly ladders up to your company's, mission or top line. So maybe it's not quite top line revenue, but it can be revenue within a specific area of the product, for example. But at the same time, like, I am a really big fan of having a metric that you can tell someone, in plain English, your mom and dad at dinner, why does this matter, And so if you're working on a checkout page, maybe like revenue is your top line metric, but people clicking the checkout button is pretty obvious. It's what you're trying to get people to do. And those go in hand. I think tying into that too, like you brought up retention. And one of the reasons data scientists don't always like retention is it's a ratio metric, and ratio metrics are tricky. If you're not paying attention to the context, like I think a really good example is if you spam people with notifications, your D1 retention will be higher, but you burn people off the product. And like long-term tests might show that, but a short-term test, it would be an absolute win. So that's like a really common thing too, is like if you have a ratio metric, you want to track the numerator and the denominator to actually understand what's going on.
Absolutely. I've run into that several times myself where the denominator has a bunch of different factors affecting it. And you might be trying to measure a change that only affects a subset of the population that is in the denominator. And it becomes extremely difficult to use and extremely difficult to understand. Another bad metric that I've come across is whenever a metric kind of gets too complex, like if you're measuring success as a click or a certain amount of time spent or a page or some other third action, what ends up happening is you're trying to figure out, these are all the different ways that a user could have success on the page. Let's aggregate them. But in practice, the team will not really understand what the levers are to move that metric. The metric will be affected by one of these different factors disproportionately, and the metric will not respond well to the experiments that you're trying to ship.
It can become a race to the bottom, right? Because holistically, absolutely, it's a good thing, but people will figure out the optimization function, which is, move this one thing.
Yeah. So to wrap up, keep
Yeah.
your metrics simple, make sure they ladder up to top line goals, make sure that they are sensitive enough to actually measure the things that you're trying to launch.
Easy enough. We've gone through multiple small experiments, fail fast, learn fast, good and bad metrics. I love all these examples. To dig a little bit and get a little bit closer to Statsig, we talk a lot about measuring and testing everything. And I think everyone at Statsig, we have it on our website. We talk to customers about, being able to measure. Talk us through like why that matters. Any specific examples, either at Statsig or previously. I think we have one up our sleeve, but let's talk a little bit about what we mean by measure and test everything, and then why that matters.
Yeah, so I think this philosophy falls out of what we were talking about the idea of like a context metric, right? Like seeing what's going on besides the one thing you're trying to move. And if you extend that, right, like experiments are a really powerful tool. You're basically isolating your one change and seeing what it does. And often that surprises you. Often it surprises you because, your core metric doesn't move the way you expect it to, but often you see something totally random moving. And now I have to say here, like, you need to be skeptical of unexpected movements and treat them with some degree of critical thought, I would say. But often you get really big learnings out of those. So like, I think I was working at a company where I was doing a recommendation system, and we realized that one class of users who was really important saw this like really huge drop in adoption after we made this change, even though net for everyone it was good. And that wasn't our core metric. But because we had tracked it by happenstance, honestly, we were able to correct that. And so that's a kind of observation where, like you accidentally put in a regression you didn't expect, but if you're measuring everything, you can catch it. And not to monologue for too long, but the way I would kind of I think a good framework for it is you should be hypothesis testing your core metric, be really rigorous, look for that statistical significance, treat it with a lot of respect. But you can have a whole bunch of metrics that you're sort of doing like an observational analysis on, and you're not looking at the results and saying this is it's not a fact, it's not a conclusive truth.
Sure.
But it points you in the right direction, and you can use that to come up with follow-ups or hypotheses.
Yeah, and I've got a really great example with one of our customers at Statsig, Rec Room, that I'd love to share.
Yeah, please.
So yeah, Rec Room, if you take a look here, I'll share my screen.
Yeah.
So Rec Room was testing out adding a new profile page for the users in their product. When you look at this objectively, the new treatment that they were taking a look at, it looks great. It looks much more modern, much more sleek. The colors work better together. I think like to the human eye, it is obviously better than the older version. But when they launched this, they noticed quite a big regression in a metric that was extremely important to them: message sends. Message sends is critical. People initiate games by sending messages to their friends.
And so Rec Room is a gaming company, right? It's like multiplayer, like a gaming platform, right?
That's right. So just taking a look at these side by side, what do you think caused this regression to message sends?
Well, it looks like they moved most of the buttons on the right side to the bottom and highlighted them orange. So it pops a little bit more in that bottom toolbar.
Absolutely, that's super close. So it is about color and positioning. So if you take a look here, the message button is now in the top right of the dialogue, and the color is a lot more subtle. Where it used to be this blue that really popped, it's now blended in with the background. The top right is also, in my experience, something that users are often blind to, because the top right is reserved for controls, close, minimize,
Search
setting
function,
controls.
yeah.
So when they moved this here, they saw that people were just not finding the message button, some subset of users, which is pretty critical. To quickly test if this was the reason that they were seeing message sends drop by a whopping 25+%,
Yeah.
they quickly adjusted the color. They made it much brighter. They made it stand out a lot more. And that did actually recover the drop. It went from, maybe negative 25 to 30% down to negative 10%. And then realizing that this really was it, they then followed up with another quick iteration where they moved it back into the body of the profile. They made the color super bright orange so it really pops off the screen. And that turned what was originally a regression with this new design that they were shipping into a win. Message sends compared to the control experience were now up like 20+%.
Wow.
So, even if it's not your core hypothesis might be that this new experience is a better experience for users, keeping an eye out for unexpected regressions and then using data to quickly iterate on those can lead to huge wins for your product. And if you're not doing this actively and you're just shipping stuff to production, it's going to lead to you shipping a lot of regressions to production without even noticing it.
Yeah, that was. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, and I want to point out, like in this example, there's 2 dimensions to measuring everything, right? One is that they happen to have this metric for message sends, which for them was important. They probably should have had that.
Sure.
But there's a lot of times you introduce regressions on something else, right? It could have been friend ads, for example. The other side of it is testing. We talk about testing everything here. It doesn't just mean put all your metrics in and see what falls out of your main experiments. It means put everything into an experiment, right? Like roll it out with a split and evaluate it. Because things that you think are obvious wins because it looks nicer might introduce some sort of hidden regression because you're just not thinking through what the typical user is doing.
Yeah, and thinking about if Rec Room didn't have a platform like Statsig, like what would they have done, right? I mean, if you see that 25% drop, I mean, that's huge. That's going to get everyone's attention. Like, what's the next step if you don't have an experimentation platform?
It takes a lot of time and becomes guesswork. Like seeing a top line drop in a chart and trying to spend loads of resources trying to figure out what launched on this date, what might have affected this. Can we look at these experiences and try and understand what might have caused the regression is just loads of wasted time for a company.
Yeah, it's a lot of time in GitHub pretty much. You just have to look for the change.
Reading lines of code, looking for it. Yeah.
Data scientists and engineers love that, right? just a wild goose chase. Great example. We'll make sure to throw up a quote onto the screen here in post of Joel, who is head of data at Rec Room, made a really nice LinkedIn post summarizing some learnings from 2023, one of which was you're probably going to have more negative impact from product ships than positive. And he's like, I forget what the takeaway is, but it's something along the lines of that doesn't mean we're not going to keep measuring and keep trying. As long as you are measuring and testing, then that's okay that those features are negative.
I think too, something to be cognizant of is the nature of the beast is very often the regressions are bigger than the wins, right?
Yeah.
You usually you put yourself into a good spot. And it's easy to lose ground. It can be hard to make those incremental improvements, right? Because if your product's good, it's hard.
Mm-hmm. It's inherent to building software. It is very difficult for one person to think through every single way that all of your users may use your product and cover all of those when you're making a design change. So it's inherent, finding and catching regression should be a part of shipping products to your users.
Yeah, and setting that expectation with the company too.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've covered a lot. We've covered metrics, importance of testing everything, why that matters. If we're still on the same topic, of course, of success in 2023, let's talk about holdouts. And there's the concept of holdouts. There's also the capital H holdouts that are a specific Statsig feature. Maybe Craig, it's okay if we start with you and just kind of take us through the concept and then why now is the time in January, February to start thinking about implementing holdouts for the longer term.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. I'll do my best to unpack. Okay. So holdouts at a high level are sort of a master experiment that you keep for a very long time, and it encapsulates all of the changes you make. So any experiments you run, the holdout group doesn't see them. Anything you ship, the holdout group doesn't see them. The point of this is you get an aggregate view of your impact throughout the half. So at the end of the half, you basically have one set of users who got the experience from 6 months ago, and you have one set of users who have seen all the new changes, and you can understand the net incrementality of the work you've done. The reason this is really valuable, well, there's a couple, but one of the really big ones is there's extrinsic factors that hit your business. COVID's a great example. During COVID, a lot of industries saw huge booms, some saw huge busts. Without a holdout, your product changes probably got lost in that mire. With a holdout, it's still influenced by COVID. Maybe an experiment works better in COVID, but you have an idea of, this much of my impact came from my changes and this much was totally extrinsic. The other side of the house is it's really useful strategically. Holdouts don't have to be a single holdout. You can nest them, right? You can have a holdout per team. You can understand, hey, this team is really moving the needle on this metric, but not on another. Or, hey, like maybe this team should move their focus because they're not having any success moving this metric that they were targeting. So they're a really useful sort of like post hoc way to evaluate the direction of your business on a rolling basis. And that's why now is a good time, right? Halves are generally when people start thinking about strategy and long-term planning, and setting that up now makes a lot of sense, right? You want to understand the impact of that block of planning. And once you have these on a rolling basis, you can use them as inputs to your planning.
Absolutely. Yeah, two ways that I've found a lot of value in holdouts personally are the cumulative impact of each of the different experiments that you're going to run is not going to be the same as the individual impact that you measured as you ship them. They're going to affect each other as you roll things out. And the other one is measuring the long-term impact of something is really critical. And it's probably going to be different to the short term. There's novelty effect for when you're shipping products. I had one holdout that I once ran for 6 months on a change which made it easier to engage with the group that a gaming video streamer was running. And at first, all the metrics were neutral. It didn't really show any gain. But we found that over a really long period, over like a 7 or an 8 month period, users became way more engaged with that streamer because they felt like they were becoming part of the community. And that is not something that you can measure with, a 2-week experiment, but having holdouts to measure the longer term impact is super valuable there.
And you highlighted something too here, like holdouts don't necessarily have to be this overall strategic holdouts. They can be feature level. Notifications are a really good example, right? Notifications almost always test well in the short term. But they do burn users, and like having a long-term holdout for your notifications work is a great way to understand that cumulative impact over time. So you can pump the brakes if you start to see red flags.
Notifications being like a mobile, like home screen notification that would pop up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like everyone in the world at this point has installed an app that sends you 8 notifications a day for the first
when
week
you wake up in the
you
morning.
engaged.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it works. But it doesn't really leave a good taste in people's mouth a lot of the time.
It's very easy to get a quick metric win over 1 week by pushing people, hey, use the product. But if you do that over a long period of time, you're going to burn your users out.
At least
they're not going to want to return to it.
Yeah, at least if you're using it willy-nilly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And one thing too, like on the topic of these extrinsic effects, like this is an expensive thing, right? I specifically remember this PM and this data science manager being at loggerheads for a month, probably like a week of mutual effort where they were just arguing over whether or not our product changes or this extrinsic factor had caused our metrics to lift. And the PM was adding up all the point estimates for the experiment, which generally it will be an overestimate. And the data scientist was being super conservative and saying, hey, like you can't prove this impact. And you can argue it in either direction. Both are valid interpretations.
Yeah.
But there's a solution here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's always good to have data to fall back on, so it's not this person or that person. We've got the proof there. We've covered a lot. This has been great. This is all of our pre-planned topics. What I'd like to do now is dig into some of the questions that folks in attendance were kind enough to submit when they registered. We've got a couple lined up that I'm really excited about. I want to start with Radhika, who is a senior product manager at Flipkart. Asks, how do you manage interference in running large-scale experiments in a multi-business unit organization? How do you guys think about that across multiple organizations, especially from a PM perspective?
Yeah, so one of the best ways to do this, and one of the ways that we did this at Facebook, was to run mutually exclusive experiments. You can use.
What do you mean by that?
So you want to effectively take a slice of the population of users and allocate experiments to a certain percentage of that slice. And what you can then do is make sure that if you have 20% of your total population of users involved in experiment A, none of those people will then be exposed to experiment B, and you won't have these weird overlaps where users might have conflicting experiments that don't mesh well. It's pretty critical when you have different orgs running at different goals, running different experiments on the same product on the same surface, having those not clash and being able to measure those things independently of other stuff that is being tested is super important.
Yeah, so one thing we believe in pretty strongly is that orthogonality is really important in experimentation. So you can get some interaction effects with this, but you can run 10x more, 100x more experiments if you're willing to let there be interaction effects. This doesn't work if you have 5 people editing the same button. You just can't do that. And so that's what we call it layers. That's what this is for. Is the idea is no one is in 2 experiments on that button, and you can set this up.
Yeah, you can also be really critical with which metrics are going to really validate the hypothesis, and making sure that those metrics that you're using are not heavily influenced by the other changes that are being made in the team.
No cross contamination almost.
Absolutely.
The experiments.
Yeah. The clashing experiments I used to run into very frequently when we would have people working on product changes for search at Facebook and people iterating quickly on the ranking models underlying. Having one ranking model may promote certain results that don't work super well with the new information architecture that you're displaying the product in. So being able to run those experiments separately was extremely important for isolating the effects of improving ranking versus changing how you're representing the different results that you're ranking.
One thing to say too is, and this is slightly in the weeds, but you can measure interaction effects. Doing it for every crosswise pair of experiments just means you're going to hit false positives. What we recommend is if you have 2 experiments running and they're orthogonal and you think they might interfere with each other, that's a good time to go in and do that ad hoc analysis and check, hey, like, is there an interaction effect here? What should we do with that? Often you can just rerun them at separate times, or you can put them, like Pierre said, into a layer so that they're mutually exclusive, and you can reevaluate the impact there.
Awesome.
And just to clarify, like, interaction effect is when the test of one experiment interacts with the test of another experiment. So maybe they cancel each other out, or maybe they inflate each other, but basically the sum is greater than the parts.
Great answer. Thank you, guys. I'm learning stuff here today. This is so fun. Our next question from Kyle, who's VP of Data at Wealth. Kyle asks, are there any recommendations you have for small companies, basically small in terms of number of users? How do you guys think about big company, medium, small? Are there any differences there?
Definitely.
This is a good question.
Feel free to be opinionated. These are recommendations.
So do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think one of the most critical things is if you are a small company, you will inherently not have that much volume in the metrics that are coming in, which means they will not be very sensitive to the changes you're trying to measure. The smallest detectable effect will be very large. So if you're a small company, try and stay away from hyper optimizing small parts of your page. If you only have 100 users coming into your page every day, you do not need to be focusing on optimizing, button colors or positioning of buttons and stuff like that. Big companies can see really big wins from that because they have, so many users coming in. But if you want to measure a 20% lift rather than a 2% lift in engagement in the page, you should be thinking in bigger scope and scale. You should be redesigning the entire page and hoping for a 20 to 30% lift, because that's something that you actually will be able to measure. Changing around colors and trying to find a 1% or 2% optimization is going to be mostly a waste of time if you're a smaller company.
Yeah, so I have sort of a laundry list for this, and the first one is, like Pierre said, like, go for big swings. If you're a small company and you can't find the occasional 5% win, you might be in trouble in the first place. That said, though, there's things you can do just from an experiment perspective. You can run big tests, right? You can communicate between PMs and say, we're not going to run, if we're in a mutually exclusive world, we should take turns. We don't want to run 25% experiments. We should be running 50% experiments where half our population gets the test. You can use techniques like Cupid to reduce variance and get more signal, especially if you have existing users with some history, you can really, really heavily reduce the variance and get Statsig results where you previously couldn't. Picking stable metrics is really, really useful here. So, you can do some analysis offline and understand like what the variance on these metrics looks like. And often if you look at like daily active users for an event, it'll be less noisy than the event count itself. And maybe that's a good enough proxy that you can use that to get stronger signal.
In that same vein, when you're thinking about reducing variance, be careful about your exposure logging when you are running experiments. You don't want to expose people at a very high point in the stack. If you're trying to measure, how many people are commenting and trying to improve the comment experience, do not expose people as soon as they land on their page. Make sure that you're only measuring the lift on the users that are actually interacting with the feature that you're trying to improve.
Yeah. And I think I have two more.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is a topic near to my heart.
Yeah.
So one that I've run into personally is a lot of smaller companies are in a growth mode and they're doing like these growth experiments. And those can be very limited because you're limited by the pool of users you have coming in, right? Like if you're doing a landing page experiment, you touch them once. And so your pool of users is your throughput. So if you're getting 1,000 users a day, you need to run an experiment for a week to get 7,000 users. Trying to focus at least part of your team on like existing user experiments on your active user base, you suddenly open up the pool because as soon as you release the users from an experiment, you get to use them again. Or you can run orthogonal experiments and be running 10 tests on this like massive pool of users. If you're getting 1,000 users a day and you have 20,000 users, well, you can do 20x the sample size on existing users. So that's actually like a pretty powerful concept, and it's worth thinking about if you are like a growth and experiment first company. You're kind of doing yourself a disservice if you're only focused on the new user experience. Even if I don't want to say it's not important, it really is. But you can parallelize this work basically. You have a choke point there that you can get around. And so the last thing I'll say, like too, from the data scientist perspective, you can adjust your experimentation practice. If you're a small company, you should have a higher appetite for risk. And what that means is, do 90% on your confidence for your tests. So, you'll get a couple more false positives, but directionally, you're probably not shipping in a negative direction and you're probably moving in a positive direction. Some people like to use Bayesian statistics to achieve sort of the same end, right? Where you get a probability best instead of, a statistical significance inference. And then, basically like, take some risks. The downside isn't as high. And, if you're testing, it's pretty unlikely if you see a large positive movement that it's negative.
Yeah, be bold, take risks, and then use as many tactics as you can to reduce variance from, which metrics you're choosing, who you're exposing, using statistical methods to reduce your variance. Make it as easy as possible to measure those big wins that you're trying to ship.
Yeah, great stuff, guys. Our last question that we have time for is from Varun, who's a senior product manager. Varun's asking, in the face of hard to move top line metrics, how do you culturally move adoption of metrics that are farther down the chain? Great question. This is right in the heart of culture of experimentation. How do you guys think about this question from Varun?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit in the metrics section, but I think the main tactic is choose a metric that is going to that is correlating with your top line metric that is higher volume and more sensitive to the changes that you're shipping.
I also want to say, like, this is a hard question.
It's a hard one.
I don't think anyone has like nailed this question. It's really tricky. I think from my perspective, it requires a lot of understanding, like shared understanding on your broad team, your company, around, what are you doing and how do the different teams roll up into that? And hopefully it should fall out of that practice, right? Like if you know that one team is trying to drive adoption, that lends itself to compelling metrics. Because I think like what I've seen in the past is things fall apart when people either don't understand why the metric they've been given matters, how it rolls up, or sometimes it rolls up but it's not compelling, or there's actually not buy-in from leadership, right? Like a team comes bottoms up and says like, hey, we want to drive like D1 retention on users with 62 seconds of activity, and the C-suite's going to say like, why do we care, right? And so having that articulation is really important, and that's a cultural thing, and it develops over time.
Yeah, it's very important for the engineering teams and the product teams that are working on stuff to understand what levers are actually going to move metric and feel like the experiments and the products that they're working on are going to actually drive those metrics positively. And then that's actually going to ladder up into top line impact for the company.
I will say like, having worked at Noom, like there's two dimensions of hard to move, right? There's hard to move, like it's just stubborn. It's hard to convince people to change their behavior. And there's hard to move where it's like, you know, Noom is a weight loss company. You don't see the outcomes of that in a week. That takes a long time, and getting proxy signals can be really hard. Weight loss is a tough industry. And so, you know, you kind of at some point have to develop a belief system and prove out that belief system. But to some extent, it requires everyone to be bought in on that together.
Yeah. I think this also ties into the whole theme that we've been talking about you know, beginning of the year planning, setting big goals for the year. Spend a lot of time getting this right now. Like, you know, have your data scientists take a look at the metrics that you are picking. You can run back tests to see how sensitive they are for the products that you have already shipped. Make sure that you get the metric right now. Put in the legwork now to get it right, so you're setting your team up for success. Because I've been in so many situations where, you know, we don't spend enough time making sure that metric is the right metric for a team, and then at the end of the half you haven't moved the metric. It's really demotivating for the team, and nobody you're kind of making excuses of, oh well, this metric wasn't great because we didn't factor in that the denominator might move this way, or these users were included. Put in the legwork now so that you're setting your team up for success.
That's kind of the gist of today's session, right?
And like, sorry to keep tagging on, but like, it can be worth it to change, right? If halfway through you realize that a metric's not going to move, it means one of two things. Either you're doing the wrong thing, or you're just measuring the wrong thing, and that has to come from a place of understanding and context. Like you know, there's not a number to determine that, but it either means that you should pivot strategically, or you should pivot in your measurement, right? And very often we've re-goaled and seen a lot of success, because it's a waste of time. If you can't move it and you're trying to optimize against it, you're just spinning your wheels and not getting anywhere.
Perfect note to end on, guys. This has been so fun. I've learned a lot. Such a good way to kick off 2023. You know, final thoughts. I feel like you guys summed it up so well just now. If you want to learn more, you know, check us out on statsig.com. Go to LinkedIn. We have a fantastic Slack community. We have our YouTube channel with demos. You know, we've got a lot of good content out there if you're interested in learning more about Statsig. We also invite you to next month's virtual webinar. Please join us on February 28th. Because you guys are attending this virtual meetup, we're going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek that it is actually FeatureGate focused. So if that sounds like something that is interesting to you, be sure to check it out February 28th. Keep a lookout, and see you next month. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Pierre.